And now we're dealing with anti, which means against, and contra, it means against. Okay? So antonym, an antonym comes from the Greek, and the onym part means name. And so what you need to notice here, you guys, is that anti is the prefix, but antonym takes away the I. Get used to it. Very often, a prefix will be shortened in order to make it easier to say the combination of the prefix with the root that follows it. Okay? So antonym is really anti-onym. Got me? But it's easier to say antonym, so you take off the I. Get used to it. That's going to happen all the time. All right? So that falls into line with this idea of etymology being kind of an art rather than a science. I mean, there's no real system to when that I will be dropped and when it won't be. What it is a reflection of the use of that combination of the prefix and the root throughout the ages. Okay? No differently than the is not to ain't to int, or whatever, those kinds of transformations. Okay, so it's all about making things easier to say throughout time. That's why the changes occur, just about exclusively. Okay? So what are antonyms? They're opposite words. So it's the opposite of a synonym. Okay, synonym means two words that supposedly mean the same thing. No two words ever really mean the same thing, by the way, nor are they exact opposites, but good enough. Okay, so hot and cold are antonyms. They're names that are against each other, so to speak, or the opposite of each other. And then get ready for some high-tech transformation here. And now we're on to contradict, kind of like the antonym thing. Okay, but in this case, contradict means to say against. Dict comes from dico, so the D-I-C root. We're going to learn all kinds of things, like to dictate and various other words like that. It means to say. So to contradict is to say the opposite of something someone else says. So yes and no are examples of contradiction. Okay, now the shun we'll get to later, because that's a suffix. Re, as in reject, whether it be the noun reject or more originally, the verb reject. And by the way, if you're learning English as a second language, this is one example of how hard it is. How the heck are you supposed to know that the verb is pronounced reject with the emphasis on ject, and the noun is with the emphasis on re? How are you supposed to know that? You know how many words there are where you have to know that in order not to sound foreign as a speaker of English? Okay, that's not the case with most languages. Okay, that's what makes English so difficult. One of the things. And then this poor guy apparently is being rejected. Okay, so that's the idea. So there's rejection, there's rejecting. It means what? Throwing back, throwing away. Okay, now we're going to look at prefixes that deal with being inside of the circle, being inside of an object, not outside of it, not going toward it from outside, not being after it, but being inside of it. And I said being inside of it. I didn't say being inside and then doing something like going outside of it, or going above it, or going below it. I mean literally being there. And that's what these are for. And there's a surprisingly small number of prefixes dealing with that. In, apud, and intro. And I don't think I'm going to do apud because that's nothing but a preposition. It's not a prefix. Okay, so there are a couple exceptions to the prepositions becoming prefixes, but I wanted to throw it in here just to give you an idea of the diversity of ideas having to do with being inside of the circle. But in and intro we are going to look at right now. So in, to inject, is to throw into. Okay, to throw inside. To inject is to throw inside. And to introject is a word that is very rare in common parlance. Every once in a while, I will give you those kinds of words, but usually not, because I want you to kick ass on the GRE and in life. And you're not going to hear the word introjection or introject very often, because it's a psychoanalytical term of art. Okay? And so what does it mean? Very easy to understand. To introject is the opposite of to project. Okay? So projection is to lay your crap on others. To introject is the opposite. And there's an example. What happened in childhood? You can't do anything right, the mother says, and underneath it did say mother, I think. And then the children learn that type of mean behavior from the mother, and then they do it to each other. That's the idea, to take in the negative behaviors of an authority figure and then to lay it out on others. It's the opposite of to project. It's to take in rather than to put out. But the reason why I'm giving you introject is to keep as much as possible to the throw root in order to illustrate all of these different prefixes so as not to throw too many roots at you yet that we haven't accounted for. Okay? And then X, pretty much the opposite, means outside, or as we'll see, out of. And so when you eject someone or something, it means to throw out. And here's another example of ejecting. These don't just go toward the circle, like the ones we looked at. They're not inside of the circle. They're not after the circle. But rather they go into and out of the circle. And again, there are not that many prefixes dealing with these ideas. Okay? So in Latin means either inside of, like we just looked at, or it means into. And then the de, apo, ex, and dis we'll deal with. And they mean in one way or another out of, but they're kind of they're a little different than just out of by itself. They mean slightly different things from each other. Let's get into them. So in, we already dealt with inject, and it's close enough. Even though there's a difference between inside of and into, it's good enough for just for us to learn inject for it. Okay? D means down or down from. De donde eres tú means what? Where are you from? So the de means from. So where did you come down from is the idea. Okay, you guys? That's how it means from. So dejection is thrown down. When one is depressed, that's pressed down. Dejected is thrown down. The de means down. Or you could talk about someone being from somewhere, and that would be de also. Down from where? In ancient Greek, apo means away from. And in Latin, ab means the exact same thing. Every once in a while, there will be a Latin preposition / prefix that is derived directly from Greek, as opposed to either just being like it or not being like it at all. Okay? And so apo, ab, the P and the B, real close to each other. Real, potentially confusing. B, p. What's the difference between them? P, p. You guys know? The P sound? Yeah, exactly. Good. The P sound, try using your voice with a P. P, p. Try to use your voice with a P. P, p, p. What does it become? It becomes a B. The only difference between a P and a B is the voice is used with the B. Isn't that sweet? Come on. Use that at dinner tonight and someone will be amazed. Okay? So that's how one came from the other. The only difference is one uses a voice, the other doesn't. Oh, I don't know. I just find that stuff amazing. All right? So apology in ancient Greek, get ready, does not mean I'm sorry. Apology originally means explanation or defense of a position. Okay? Look at that. A reasoned argument or writing in justification is something typically a theory or religious doctrine. So apo means a way, and the logi comes from logos, as we'll see, which, among other things, means word or speaking. To speak out. To speak out, to defend one's position is an apology. Okay? And then by extension, over time, it means I'm sorry, because I'm bringing out my emotions toward you and letting you know that I feel terrible about what happened. But that's an outgrowth of the original meaning. And what is the most famous use of the word apology to mean what it originally meant? Socrates' apology, the one that was preserved by Plato, the idea of him being in court and defending his position about why he refuses to stop philosophizing even at the threat of death. Abject, on the other hand, this was Google image. This is a beautiful example of why I rely on the zeitgeist element of using Google image to give me images that correspond to the words we're looking at. Can't get much more abject than that. We're talking about Dust Bowl objection. Eject means throw. Ab, interestingly, you guys, means away. So they are thrown away by society. Tell me that's not interesting and sad. Okay, so abject poverty. Poverty comes from the word meaning poor. So abject poorness. Abject poverty means thrown away poverty. Poverty is so bad that you're just forgotten by society. You see how these things are stories in themselves, especially when linked with images that kind of, help you understand the depth of what they really mean as opposed to what people either do or don't mean when they use them impressionistically in the way that we hear them in the media or whatever. Words are used without necessarily being completely understood. I mean, you might agree with me. Okay, so with X, and which is really the same thing as E for the reason that I just told you guys, that quite often elements will be lopped off of prefixes depending on what the root is that follows them. X and E are the same prefix. It's just sometimes it's easier to say E than X, such as what if you had to say, hey, have you exjected that DVD yet? No, it's easier to say eject. Okay, that's why. So we'll stick with eject, we already learned. And then for dis, here we go again with a word that isn't very common in English, simply because I want to stick to yakio and ject as much as I can today, and next time if it takes it for the prefixes. And so to disject something is a word from the 16th century that was not even used very often then, and now it's completely out of use. But there it is. It means to scatter, such as to scatter the ashes of someone after they've died, is to disject the ashes. Another use of a prefix meaning away from, okay? Just like ab meant away from, but with a little difference between them that will come clear when we look at various words that incorporate them, that I won't get into the distinction between them now because it would just be a little too hyper-analytical at the moment. Okay, and then every once in a while I'll check out Urban Dictionary just to see what's going on in the underground with some of these words. And believe it or not, and I love this kind of irony, we're talking about a word from the 16th century that was barely used, and then it pretty much died, and then leave it up to good old Urban Dictionary to keep it alive. And I must admit, I did not know that this word is used, apparently, to mean a tool. Someone that gets you mad, pissed off, a person that is overly nice but still socially rejected because of perceived hate and personal lowered gates. That damn disject needs to stop sucking up to the new boss. All right? Well, there you go. Okay? So that's an example of taking a way old word that is never used anymore and turning it into a new word that is used in a specialized context for whatever reason. To be hip, to be creative, or whatever. Now, I'm not going to get into many of those for the reason I said earlier, that I'm going to stick pretty much to the words in common currency, but the reason I did it here is that I'm sticking with yakio, so that's why I'm sticking with disject here instead of something like dismay or disagreement. Okay, so now these are also inside the circle, but now they start inside the circle and now they go outside of it. But not just as simple as out of the circle or away from the circle, like the other ones we just looked at, but specifically above the circle and below the circle. So when you talk about anatomy, anatomy means cutting up things. Ana means up, in the sense of the direction up, as opposed to above, which means standing above. You see the difference? When you go up, that's different than being above, okay? So anatomy, the ana means up, and the tomi comes from temno in Greek, meaning to cut. So it means to cut up the body. And then Superman, what the heck? I'm keeping things simple when it comes to roots, so I just, anything that uses super. Nietzsche is pretty much responsible for the very archetype of Superman, this idea of the Overman, the Übermann in German. And then you go down, okay? So now we're talking about a catastrophe such as the Titanic. And what does it mean? Another pretty interesting one. Strophe in Greek means turn. And kata means down, so it means to turn down, to turn downward. to turn downward. It means a disaster that originally had to do with the ship capsizing. Why? Because we're talking about the ancient world where ships were a giant deal. You didn't have airplanes yet, okay? You might be talking about something different than that metaphor of the going down if you're talking about an airplane. But you're not, because you didn't have them yet. So it's historically reflective of what the situation was. As far as subject goes, we already dealt with subject in connection with subject and predicate, and we talked about the sub meaning under and the ject meaning throw. The subject of a sentence is the nomen that is thrown down, that is at the surface of the sentence, upon which you add the predicate. But here's another example of subject. All vehicles entering or leaving subject to search. Okay, so what does that mean? It means there they are lying there. They're lying there waiting to get searched. Okay, so they can be legitimately searched. They're subject to searching. So they have been thrown down so that they're vulnerable to search, is the idea. Okay, guys? So it's a pretty malleable idea there of subject. Then hyper and super are really the same thing. Super comes from hyper, okay? And now we're talking not about going up, but being up. That's the major difference here when it comes to prefixes. Things that are already somewhere and things that are changing from one place to another. So there's already there, and then there's going from one place to another. And hyper and super, let's take a look at those. And then the hypo and sub mean already below as opposed to going down below. Okay? This whole idea of hyperactive to active, above active, as in too much activity is what that means. Okay? It means above in the sense of too much of it. All right? So he looks like he's just having a good time to me. But this came up in Google Image, so I'll throw it out there. Okay? Now, above versus upward, I just explained the difference to you, so I don't have to ask that again. And then hypo means below. Okay, we already dealt with super with Superman. So hypo means below, and so does sub. So a hypodermic needle means a below the skin needle. Derma in Greek means skin. And then subcutaneous means under the skin in Latin. So that's an exact equivalent. And so whether you talk about a hypodermic needle or you talk about something subcutaneous, you're dealing with below. Okay? Below, in this case, the skin. Once we're done with all these, there's no more of this kind of thing. This is stuff that is hard to take all at once. I'm with you, okay? But it's important. So way to hang in there, okay? Peri means around, such as with a periscope, an around scope. Periscope, which some of you may use, is named that because the idea is looking around, looking all over the world. It's named after that. And if you go to Paris and you're a movie buff, there's an actual publication that plays with the word periscope by turning it into Periscope because it's in Paris, and it deals with looking all over the place, kind of the Periscope app for figuring out what movies are playing in Paris. And then you have circumference. Circumference of a circle, we all know what that means. The fair just means carry, so it means to carry around the circle. And then ambient, if you talk about ambient music, for example, or just the ambient sounds, it just means the sounds that are around you. Okay, the sounds that are around you, or the music that is just around you. The idea behind ambient music is that it's music that isn't meant to be listened to. It's meant to just be there as part of your world without really noticing it. And then dia comes from the Greek, and just as we have circumference, so we have diameter. Dia means through. It says don't confuse with peri, around. We just learned that peri means around. Don't confuse that with per. Dia means through, and so does per. Dia is Greek, per is Latin. Diameter means the through measurement, the measurement through a circle. And so really through a sphere is what it really means. You go through a sphere rather than through a two-dimensional circle, right? And then perspective, maybe most interestingly out of these. So one guy on this tiny little island sees a boat, and he's all excited. He says, "Boat, Yeah, cool, there's a boat. And then the guy on the boat is wanting to find land somewhere, and he sees the guy on this tiny patch of land, and he screams out land. So they have different perspectives on the objective situation. So different subjective views about what's going on. So how does that work? The iv, like I said before, we'll get to when we get to suffixes. The spect means to look, like with spectacles, to look or watch something. And then the per means through, so to look through. It means the filter through which you look at the world. That's perspective. Nice, right? So that's a really good example of taking a word that is normally used very impressionistically, say in the media. Hey, that's your perspective. When someone says that word, are they thinking, hey, that's the filter you look through? Maybe, maybe not. But it's good to know that it comes from that. And then epi means upon, as when you talk about the epicenter of an earthquake, the point at which the earthquake emanates.